In the gray light of a late autumn morning, Maria stepped onto the broken path that led into Darnwick, her boots slick with the mud of the hillside, the hem of her dress dark with dew and road dust. A wind from the east chased the scent of frost down the lane, threading through the hedgerows and rusted gateposts, curling cold around the empty windows of shuttered homes. She carried a single canvas sack slung across her back, its corners worn soft by years of use. And in her right hand she held a bundle wrapped in a child's shawl, faded wool, mended at the corners, smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke. No one noticed her arrival. No one greeted her or asked what she sought. Darnwick had stopped asking long ago. The village sat low in the hills, its stone cottages hunched against one another like old men in prayer, the thatch of their roofs patchy with moss and rain rot. A single dirt track ran through its spine, flanked by a well with a cracked wooden yoke and a chapel whose bell no longer rang. There had once been color here, once the sound of laughter spilling from doorways in the evening, once the sweet tang of apples in the press and the ringing of tin cups in the tavern. But that had been years ago, before the crop sickness, before the fever years, before the men had gone south to war and not come back. Now the village was a place of waiting, hollow-eyed and half-starved, watching the seasons change with the patience of those who have forgotten how to hope for better. Maria moved through it like smoke, unnoticed at first, her eyes tracing every shuttered window, every lintel carve a forgotten family crest. She did not pause until she reached the edge of the village square, where the old miller's cottage slumped beneath a leaning willow. Its front door was slightly ajar, as if in resignation, and inside the air was thick with mildew and dust, but the stone hearth stood firm, and that was all she needed. She set her sack down slowly, as one might lower a sleeping child, and stood in the center of the single room, the silence pressing close around her, the breath of the place heavy with abandonment. It smelled of damp grain and something older, something sweet and sorrowful, as if the memory of bread still lingered in the walls. She unpacked methodically, a curved iron bread hook, a threadbare apron with a single embroidered poppy above the heart, a round tin of salt, a jar of starter, nestled in linen, still warm from her body. She moved with the slow grace of someone long acquainted with solitude, whose hands remembered tasks even when the mind had gone quiet with grief. There was no fire yet, no water in the cracked basin, no food beyond the flour in her bag, and a half loaf of yesterday's meal. But she did not hurry. She lit a single beeswax candle and placed it in the center of the hearth, then sat beside it cross-legged, the bundle still in her lap. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden spoon smoothed by use and a worn child's mitten, its thumb sewn on sideways. She pressed it to her cheek and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind rose. By midday, the first villager noticed her. A boy of about 9, walking barefoot to well, saw the smoke curling from the miller's chimney and ran home shouting that the bread woman had come. By dusk, there were murmurs. Some said she was a gypsy. Others claimed she was one of the hill folk, come down from the moors to sell cursed food. A few, remembering stories whispered during last winter's frost, thought her a widow from the southern reaches, one of the nameless poor who followed the hunger north. But no one knocked, no one welcomed her, not even Parla, the widow who watched all newcomers with a tight-lipped suspicion born of too many lost children and too many winters where the firewood ran out. On her second morning in Darnwick, Maria opened her door before the sun rose. She kneaded in silence, flour dust catching in her hair, the dough stiff and stubborn beneath her fingers. She added water one spoonful at a time, stretching it with mashed chestnut and crumbled oats, folding it with the heel of her palm as if trying to coax tenderness from something that had forgotten how to be soft. She worked until her arms ached, until the light in the sky turned pink with the first breath of dawn, then shaped the dough into 2 rough loaves and set them beside the embers to rise. She did not sing. She did not pray. She only waited. When the loaves were done, hard-crusted, misshapen, and smelling faintly of wood smoke, she wrapped them in muslin and stepped into the road. At the village edge, she placed one loaf at the base of the chapel door and the other on the widow Parla's windowsill. No note, no explanation. She turned and walked back to the mill, her feet leaving wet prints on the stones, her hands empty. She spent the rest of the day repairing the roof with scrap timber and boiled horse glue. That night, The wind howled louder, but no one disturbed her door. The next day, she baked again. 3 loaves this time. One with crushed rowan berries mixed into the dough, one plain, and one filled with foraged nettle and wild garlic. She left one at the chapel again. One she placed at the corner of the well. The third she carried to the schoolhouse, which had not seen children for over a year. Each evening, she returned to find her offerings gone, the linen wrap left folded, the space swept clean. But when she walked through the village the next morning, heads turned away. A man spat in the dust as she passed. A girl threw a stone that missed her shoulder by an inch and then ran. They said she was cheapening the baker's craft. That real bread wasn't made from weeds and boiled bark. That she was playing saint when what people needed was work, not pity. Someone muttered that she was feeding them poison. Another swore that his child had sickened from her nettle loaf. Marya listened to none of it. She kept baking, her hands steady, her eyes focused, her mouth always silent. One afternoon, the village baker, a thick-shouldered man named Kern, approached her stall at the edge of the market square, where she laid out her loaves on a cloth of faded green. He stared at the round barley buns, the ragged sourdough knots, the biscuits pressed with child's thimble, and then looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This isn't bread," he said, his voice flat. "This is desperation." Marya met his eyes and said nothing. "You're giving it away for nothing. You'll teach them to beg instead of buy." She folded the cloth slowly, her hands calm. "They have nothing left to buy with." Kern made a sound of disgust and turned away, but others were watching now, some with guilt, some with scorn, some with something closer to hunger. That night, Marya sat beside her oven long after the coals had burned down. Her hands smelled of ash and thyme. The spoon from her bundle lay in her lap, and she traced its grain with her thumb, over and over, until the motion lulled her into stillness. She remembered a girl, herself, long ago, baking with her mother in a kitchen full of light, the smell of rising yeast, the warmth of hands guiding hers. She remembered hunger, too, and how her mother had looked into that hunger and said, softly, "We give what we have, even when it's not enough." She slept that night wrapped in her apron, the shawl folded beneath her head. Outside, frost crept over fields, and in the morning, before the sky turned gray, she was at the hearth again, making bread, not for gratitude, not for salvation, but because someone had to remember how. By the time a week had passed, the village of Darnwick had begun to regard Marya not as a curiosity, but as something between a warning and a stain. She did not belong, that much was clear. Her presence, though silent and unobtrusive, had a way of unsettling the stillness they had grown used to, the brittle sort of stillness that forms in places starved of joy. There was something too stubborn in her perseverance, too unspoken in her purpose. She did not attend chapel, did not trade at the tavern, did not gossip near the well or linger in the market square. She rose before light, baked in solitude, and disappeared into the tree-thick shadows near the mill as dusk gathered like damp wool. Her bread, coarse and unfamiliar, appeared like offerings, left at thresholds, placed gently on stones, wrapped in bits of muslin and twine. But instead of gratitude, she drew suspicion. Bread that asked for nothing in return began to seem like a kind of insult in a place where everything cost more than it should have. Children watched her from alleys and hedges, faces smudged with soot, daring one another to throw stones or shout slurs. They called her Crumb, which in Mudwife, and though none of their voices carried real venom, they echoed off the stone walls and made her flinch some days. The adults were less direct, but their judgment came in other ways. Averted eyes, doors shut a little more firmly when she passed, silence at the stalls when she approached. When she left loaves near the chapel steps, the priest began collecting them in silence and burying them behind the vestry, as if they carried the stain of sin or heresy. The bakery, still open though dwindling, refused to sell to anyone who had taken Marya's bread. It became a kind of unspoken rule. To accept her food was to align yourself with something unwanted, something shameful. Hunger became less painful, perhaps, than being associated with the woman in the miller's cottage. Even Parla, the widow whose sharp tongue kept order among the village women, eventually confronted her. not with malice, but with the resigned firmness of someone who had seen too many seasons go wrong. She came one morning just after sunrise, her apron tied tight across her waist, her eyes rimmed with the fine red of a sleepless night. Maria was kneading dough in the front garden, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her knuckles dusted with flour and cracked from the cold. She did not stop when Parla approached, but she paused her motion enough to acknowledge her presence. "You mean well," Parla began, not unkindly, "but you don't know this place. We've buried more people than we've saved, and kindness around here's got a cost. Your bread's good enough, maybe for the belly, but people need more than that to live. They need to believe they're still worth paying for." Maria didn't respond immediately. She shaped the dough into a round, then set it gently on the flour cloth to rest. Her hands lingered over it. As if reluctant to release the small life she had coaxed from water and grain. "I don't need thanks," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I only want them to have something warm." Parla sighed, rubbing her wrist as if it ached. "And when that warmth turns cold, who do they blame? You've made something out of nothing, and people don't trust what they don't understand. They think you're showing them up. They think you're hiding something. I'm not. But they don't know that, do they?" Parla's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Don't give them more reason to look sideways at you. If you must bake, sell it proper. Price it fair. Don't hand it out like charity in the street. We've had enough of that dressed up as pride." Maria did not answer. The silence stretched until Parla turned and walked away, her boots crunching softly in the frostbitten grass. Maria returned to her dough, kneading slowly, as if her hands could push back against the edges of something too large to name. That afternoon, she brought her bread to the market for the first time. She carried it in a basket lined with burlap, each loaf carefully wrapped in cloth and marked with a small chalk sign indicating its ingredients: barley and rye, chestnut and nettle, dried apple and cracked wheat. She found a patch of stone at the edge of the square, between the barrel maker's stall and the woman who sold boiled roots and pickled greens. She laid out her cloth and placed the loaves in a neat row, then sat cross-legged behind them, her hands folded in her lap. For the first hour, no one came near. A few glanced her way, then turned quickly aside, their eyes slipping past her as if she were part of the stone. The village was quiet, too quiet for a day that should have hummed with the low thrum of trade and bargaining. There were fewer goods now, less flour, less meat, fewer jars of summer preserved jam. People bartered scraps and tokens, a spool of thread, a shard of soap, a single egg. Maria watched it all with the stillness of someone used to being overlooked. She did not call out, did not advertise. She simply waited. Eventually, a girl approached, thin, freckled, hair tied back in a rag that had once been blue. She looked no older than 13. Her hands were wrapped in fingerless gloves, and she held a single button in her palm, clenched so tightly the edges had marked her skin. She paused before the loaves, her eyes scanning them with cautious hunger. "This one's got apple?" she asked, pointing to the smallest round. Maria nodded. The girl held out her button. "It's real. Mother of pearl." Maria took the button gently and placed it in a small tin beside her. She handed the girl the loaf. Their fingers touched briefly, warm against the winter air. "Thank you," the girl whispered. Maria didn't reply. The girl ran off, cradling the bread like a prize. After that, more came, slowly, carefully, as if testing the limits of something fragile. They offered scraps of cloth, worn-down nails, smooth stones, tiny tokens of worth. Maria took them all without judgment, assigning no value, accepting what was given with the quiet dignity of one who remembered when pride had be tucked beneath the hunger. She did not haggle. She did not smile. But her presence became part of the market's rhythm, an odd but persistent pulse at its outer edge. Still, many avoided her. Some laughed under their breath when they passed. A boy once mimicked her posture, crouching beside a pile of pebbles and muttering nonsense spells until his father cuffed him on the ear. Others muttered darker things, that she had bewitched a starter, that she baked with ash from old bones, that she had no family because she had fed them to the fire. Ridiculous things, but fear rarely listened to reason. It listened to hunger and to the shadows cast by unfamiliar kindness. At night, alone in the miller's cottage, Maria cleaned the hearth with a willow brush, wrapped the remaining loaves in cloth, and counted her buttons and scraps. She kept them in a box beneath her bed, not for their worth, but for what they signified. Proof that someone had chosen her bread, that someone had received it. She held each token in her hands as if holding a memory, whispering to herself not names, but feelings, a trace of the girl's freckled cheek, the tremor in an old man's hand, the hesitation in a mother's eyes before she offered her last hairpin. They did not thank her, not often, but sometimes their silence held something else, something close to reverence. Maria knew she would never be fully accepted here. She knew that even if the hunger eased and the fields turned green again, there would always be those who looked at her and saw something foreign. Her bread would never be soft and white and sweet. It would always be dense, dark, filled with roots and seeds and the stubborn flavors of survival. But that was the bread she knew, the bread her mother had taught her to make when the world began to fall apart, the bread that could stretch through winter, the bread that even mocked, even feared, still fed. And so she continued to knead, to rise, to bake, not for praise, not even for forgiveness, but because in the act of making bread, coarse and bitter and honest, she remembered who she was, and in giving it away, even in a village that mocked her, she remembered who she still wished to be. It began as many calamities do, not with thunder or fire, but with a quiet change of the air, a stillness that sank too deep into the soil, a strange thinness in the morning mist, a heaviness in the bones that could not be blamed on winter alone. The fever came softly at first, like a tired guest knocking at the edge of the village, a child's cough lingering too long, a farmer's shivering hands beneath the blanket even as the fire roared. Then came the night sweats, the hollow eyes, the trembling that didn't stop even after prayer or poultice. By the time the village noticed what had taken root among them, it was already moving from home to home with a kind of cruel precision that knew how to find the weakest doors. At first, the wealthier families locked themselves inside their houses, barricading their windows with nail boards and layers of oilcloth, whispering over herbal brews and hoping their coin would buy them distance from death. Some sent riders to family downriver, pleading for carriages, for medicine, for safe passage to safer towns. A few got out before the roads iced over. Most did not. The fever, whatever name it bore, was not deterred by gates or good intentions. It slid through the keyholes, settled into the cracks of the mortar, and waited patiently. The butcher was the first to die, then the blacksmith's youngest, then the mother who sang to herself while cleaning the church steps. The sound of mourning became a constant murmur beneath the wind. Maria did not retreat. She did not bore her doors or hide behind shutters. Each morning, while the bell in the chapel remained stubbornly silent, she lit her oven and began the slow, familiar rituals of baking. Water, flour, salt, time. She worked without the luxury of good grain now. The stores were gone. No deliveries came up the hill from the grain towns. The mill's old wheel was frozen still, and no one spoke of next season sowing. But the land, though bitter, still offered enough to fill the gaps. She foraged wild barley and coarse oat grass, soaked moss overnight to soften it into the dough, ground the roots of dandelion and burdock until they resembled meal. She peeled and dried bark shavings, blended them with crushed nuts, and added what remained of her dried apples for sweetness. Her loaf became denser, darker, but still rose faithfully in the warm stone belly of the oven. Each day, she wrapped her bread in linen and walked to the village with a basket slung across her hip. She never knocked. She simply left the bread where she knew it was needed, beside the doorstep of the coughing man, whose wife had stopped coming to the well, beneath the cracked window of the weaver's home where the curtains had stayed drawn for days, in the hollow of the chapel's stone steps where a fevered child had once fallen asleep waiting for prayer. She didn't look into windows. She didn't ask questions. She gave what she had, and then she returned to the cottage with her empty basket and sat by the fire, hands burned and stiff from heat and cold, body aching with fatigue that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with being watched and still choosing not to hide. Though she said little, her presence became a kind of rhythm in the village, a shape in the corner of the eye, a hush that followed the scent of smoke and sage and warm grain. Some took her bread in silence. Others left small tokens in return, a folded strip of linen, a half-burned candle, a root vegetable long gone soft but still edible. But not all gestures were kind. One morning, she found a message carved into the wooden door of the cottage. Asterisk, witch's bread is death's delight. Asterisk, the word were crude, the knife marks fresh. She stood before them a long while, the wrapped loaf still heavy in her arms, the winter sun catching on the blade of her shadow. Then she opened the door and went inside without a word. That night, she slept with a kitchen knife beneath her pillow, though she told herself it was only in case of wolves. The next day, her oven went cold, not because she was afraid and not because she lacked fuel, but because she had nothing left to bake. Her jars were empty, her sack of flour gone. Even the moss and nettles had withered beneath the frost. She stood before the hearth with her hands outstretched and found only silence in the ash. The bread she had made the day before had been the last she could manage without more from the land, and the land had turned its back. By dusk, the cottage was dark, the windows shuttered, the fire cold. Maria sat at the wooden table with her mother's spoon in her hands, running her thumb over the worn edge as if waiting for an answer. She had made do with less before. She had stretched crumbs into meals and famine into feasts. But she had never baked into emptiness before. Never risen before dawn to feed people she could not even name, only to feel the walls of the world close and without even the comfort of heat. That night, as the village slept fitfully beneath the fever's grasp, a stone struck her door. It hit hard, sharp and fast enough to splinter the old wood. She rose from the table and opened it slowly, half expecting a torch or a figure with hatred in their voice. But there was only the stone and a boy no older than 10, standing barefoot in the snow. His breath came in ragged clouds, his cheeks flushed with illness or cold or both. "You lied," he said, his voice cracked and dry. "You said you'd keep feeding us." Maria said nothing. "There's none today," he spat. "You gave it all away. Now we're nothing." She stepped out into the cold, barefoot, and walked toward him until the light from her doorway touched his face. He did not back away. "I have no more to give," she said. He looked at her, as if that were the worst betrayal of all. "Then what good are you?" The question struck deeper than any blade. She stood there as he turned and ran, leaving the stone where it had fallen, her breath turning to frost in the air between them. The snow beneath her feet bit hard, but she didn't move. She stood until her skin burned from the cold, then returned to the hearth and sat before the cold oven, the spoon now in her lap, the silence more complete than it had ever been. But when morning came, she rose again, not with hope, not with certainty, only with the same rhythm she had always known: water, flour, salt, time. She had nothing, but still she reached. She walked into the forest with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders and her mother's timbole in her hand. She dug in the soft patches where the snow had melted just enough to reveal sorrel and wood violet. She cracked frozen berries from their thorny cages. She peeled bark with careful hands and listened to the trees as they whispered survival. By nightfall, she had enough for 2 small loaves. She mixed them in silence, adding her breath, her body heat, her memory. She kneaded with the heel of her hand until the dough surrendered its stiffness. She let them rise slowly near the fire, which she had coaxed back to life with scraps and splinters. When they were done, dense, almost black, and flecked with bits of dried herb, she wrapped them and left them again, one at the chapel, one on a windowsill where a cough had echoed through the night. She did not know if they would be eaten. She did not know if the boy would return, but she had baked again, from what little she had, from what the earth still offered, from something deeper than hunger. And in that act, small, unseen, absurd in its quiet stubbornness, she continued to resist the closing of the world around her, not by shouting, not by begging, not by running, but by rising each day and placing something warm into the hands of a place that no longer knew how to ask for it. Her bread, no longer mocked, was now feared, then needed, then missed. And so the first shift in Darnwick's long silence did not come from medicine nor miracle, but from the return of the scent in the wind. Not death, but dough, not prayer, but a loaf, made by hands no longer asking to be understood, only offering, again and again, the taste of what it meant to still be human. Long before the fever, before Darnwick and its bitter winters, Before the loaves shaped by hunger and bark, Maria had lived in a house built of clay and light, perched on the slope of a valley where sun filtered through lavender fields and the wind came sweet from the east. It had been a narrow house, small enough that footsteps in the kitchen could be heard all the way to the back garden, where rosemary and thyme had grown in untamed clusters between crooked stepping stones. The walls had been a pale ochre, always warm to the touch in summer and cool in the mornings, and inside, the kitchen had been the heart, low-beamed ceiling, shelves crowded with glass jars, a hearth that never truly went out, and a table where every scar on the wood held a memory of bread making. Her mother had risen before the sun each morning, the way the old women did in that place, tying back her curls with a strip of linen that had once belonged to Maria's grandmother, sleeves rolled to the elbow, fingers already dusted with flour by the time the birds began their songs. The windows would fog as water boiled and the sourdough starter was stirred gently with a wooden spoon that had belonged to generations before them. Maria had stood beside her, too small at first to reach the countertop, her chin barely above the bowl's rim, watching her mother's hands move with a grace that seemed ancient, almost sacred, as if she was conjuring something living from the dust of the earth. There had been laughter in those mornings. Sometimes silence, too, the comfortable kind, filled with the quiet music of spoon against ceramic, of dough slapping against stone, of firewood crackling low and steady in the hearth. Her mother spoke in rhythms, rarely wasted words, often choosing to teach by gesture. "Flour doesn't ask," she once said. "It listens. Let your hand speak to it, and it'll rise better." The bread was never just bread. It was ritual. It was story. It was a way her mother remembered her own mother, who had baked through war and scarcity, who had once fed a soldier with the last crust of her ration and said afterward, "It's not about the bread. It's about who you feed it to." Their family had survived by stretching, by softening the impossible into something edible. Maria's first memory of grief was not a funeral or a tear, but the day the flour tin ran empty and her mother looked at it as though it had betrayed them. Still, they baked that night, with lentils and crushed chestnut, with the last egg traded from a neighbor, with scraps of dry herbs salvaged from the edge of the garden. The loaf came out darker than usual, heavier, but it steamed when broken, and her mother held it as if it were a newborn. As she grew older, Maria had taken over more of the tasks. She had learned to knead with rhythm, learned the way dough should feel under the heel of the palm, the resistance that signaled life, the softness that meant it was ready to rest. Her mother had watched her with a quiet pride that Maria hadn't understood until years later, when the kitchen stood empty and the window no longer fogged. It had been during the third year of the war, when soldiers arrived with tired eyes and iron on their breath, knocking not out of anger but need. They took the stores, then the preserves, then the bread, cooling on the sill. Maria remembered the way her mother gave it without hesitation, not even asking who they were fighting for. "A hungry man holds no loyalty," she said, "but he might hold gratitude." That winter had been harder than any before it. The fields were bare, the livestock gone, the roads thick with mud and refugees who left behind more stories than they took with them. Maria and her mother learned to bake with wild grass, with soaked acorns, with dried beetroot and powdered bark. They ground bones for flour when it came to that. Her mother said little during those days, her body thinner, her movements slower, but her eyes sharp as ever. She kept the starter alive through sheer will, feeding it with tiny bits of fermented fruit and whispering to it like it was a child. "This," she once told Maria, "is what keeps us human, this small life in a jar. If we can coax it to live, maybe we can too." They made one loaf each day just enough. Half they ate, half they gave. There was always someone knocking. A woman with a sick infant, a man whose cart had broken and left him walking for 2 days without food, children with red hands and hollow cheeks who said nothing, only stared until her mother passed them a piece wrapped in cloth. Maria didn't question it, even when her stomach gnawed at itself. Her mother had made the lesson clear. Bread given freely binds more tightly than bread sold. It is harder to forget the hand that fed you than the one that traded. It was on one of those days, late in the season when the frost had already started to creep through the door frames, that her mother fell ill. At first it seemed like nothing more than fatigue, a deeper tiredness than usual. But then came the fever, the trembling, the silence. Maria had sat by her side with the starter jar clutched to her chest, unsure if it would be needed for bread or burial rites. Her mother had opened her eyes once in the night and whispered, "Keep it warm, keep it fed." Not about herself, about the dough. She died before morning, her body wrapped in the linen she'd used for shaping bread, her hands still carrying the faint scent of yeast and thyme. Maria had buried her alone in a rye field, where the wind always felt gentle and the soil still remembered their labor. She marked the grave with a flat stone and the spoon they'd always used, planted deep in the earth like a sapling. That day, she baked a single loaf of the last of the flour and left it by the door. Someone took it before nightfall. She never saw who. That was the beginning of her wandering. She carried the starter in a jar wrapped in linen, fed it with bits of whatever she could find. Apple peel, sugar stolen from an inn, the juice of wild grapes crushed between her fingers. In every town, she offered bread, and in every town, she was either welcomed as a curiosity or rejected as a burden. She rarely stayed long. People could not understand why someone would give without asking. They assumed madness or pride or some darker purpose. But she gave because it was all she had left, because bread had shaped her hands and her memory, because every crust she broke was another knot in the thread that tied her to the warmth of that ochre kitchen, to the breath of a mother who had given everything without asking the world to love her for it. And now, in Darnwick, the scent of her loaves hung over streets where people no longer smiled. In the flicker of her oven's glow, she still saw her mother's face, not as it was in sickness, but as it had been in that early morning light, arms deep in dough, a line of flour across her cheek, humming a tune no one else remembered. Maria didn't speak of her. She didn't tell the villagers where the spoon in her drawer came from, or why the wooden bowl was lined with linen that had been patched a dozen times. She kept those things close, like embers, but sometimes, when she broke a loaf open with her hands and the steam rose into the air, she felt her mother there, not in words, not even in memory exactly, but in the way to which she had passed down, a way of being, a form of love so quiet and uncelebrated that it could only live in something as simple as bread, something made by hand, something meant to be shared. And so, even as the village turned from her or whispered behind her back, even as fever raged and suspicion festered, Maria baked, because to stop would be to forget, because every rising was an act of remembrance, and because she still believed, with the stubborn hope her mother had carried into grave, that somewhere in the taste of crust and crumb, a person could remember who they had been before hunger hardened their hearts. The man appeared on the fifth morning after the snow turned to sleet, when the sky hung low and silver over Darnwick and the village streets glistened with the icy melt of false thaw. Maria had risen early, as she always did, her breath white in the air of the cold cottage, her fingers stiff as she broke the crusted ice from the water bucket beside the hearth. She had stoked the fire before dawn, layered the embers with dry bark and the last of her forage kindling, coaxing the warmth back into the stones that lined the belly of her oven. Her dough had risen slowly overnight in the bowl covered with a patched linen cloth, a mixture of what remained, fermented rye, crushed chestnut flour, bits of sprouted grain she'd coaxed to life in the dark corner near the chimney. She folded it gently, humming under her breath, not a song but a sound with no name, something that lived in her bones. The loaf she shaped that morning was smaller than usual, but dense and fragrant, the dough flecked with dried rosemary and wild garlic she'd dried in the weeks before frost sealed the hills. She let it rest on the warm hearthstone, covered it with a wool scarf, and waited. She had just pulled it from the oven when the knock came, not on her door, but faintly against the window pane. As if from someone uncertain whether they were welcome, she turned, her hands still dusted in flour, and saw the shape of a man hunched just outside, his shoulders draped in a threadbare cloak darkened by melting snow, his breath fogging the glass in slow, uneven clouds. She opened the door without speaking, and he stumbled in, nearly falling against the frame, his legs weak beneath him. He did not collapse, but only just. She caught him beneath the arm and guided him to the wooden stool near the hearth. He smelled of ash and rain, of old sweat and something bitterer, fever perhaps, or grief. His eyes, when he met hers, were rimmed with red, the skin around them slack with exhaustion. He said nothing at first, only held his hands out toward the fire. They trembled visibly. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, but raw with whatever had brought him to her threshold. She offered him a piece of the loaf she had just removed from the oven, tore it with her hands, and passed it to him without ceremony, the steam rising in thin ribbons. He took it wordlessly, held it for a moment, then ate slowly, chewing with care, as if the act itself was a kind of reverence. When he was halfway through the piece, he stopped and looked at her again. "They said you'd feed anyone," he murmured, voice hoarse from cold. Didn't believe it. Thought maybe they meant for a price. Or a sermon. Maria said nothing. She poured him a cup of warm water with a pinch of nettle steeped in it and placed it beside him. He drank and sighed, the sound of it low and hollow, and stared at the loaf on the table as if it held a memory. "My wife died last winter," he said after a pause, "and my son 2 months ago. Fever took him in 2 days. There wasn't anything left to burn. I buried him in a field. No marker, just stone." Maria folded the cloth over the remaining bread and set it beside the fire. "I haven't eaten in 2, he added, quieter. Still, she did not speak. She handed him the rest of the loaf and returned to kneading the next batch with a methodical rhythm that anchored her through every sorrow. The man ate slowly, his shoulders relaxing, the color beginning to return to his face. He watched her hands move, knead, turn, fold, press, his gaze lingering not in judgment, but with the cautious wonder of someone witnessing something sacred in its ordinariness. "You do this every day?" he asked after some time. She nodded. "For who?" "For whoever comes," she answered simply. He said nothing for a long while. She heard the crackling of the fire, the breath of the oven, the sound of sleet against the shutters. He looked around the cottage, noting the absence of luxury, the simplicity of her world. No trinkets, no painted plates, just the oven, the table, the wooden bowl, and a few objects placed with quiet care. Her mother's spoon, the worn shawl, the jar starter. "You live alone?" She nodded again. "Do you ever ask why they keep taking it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because hunger doesn't lie," she said. "If they take it, they need it." He watched her for a while longer, then stood, his body still fragile but straighter. He touched the table lightly with his fingers, the way one might touch an altar. "I'll come tomorrow," he said, and then, as if offering something sacred in return, "I can chop wood." She said nothing but nodded. The next morning he returned. He brought no payment, no offering, only his body and his hands, and he split the logs behind the cottage until sweat streamed down his back despite the cold. Maria said little, as was her way, but she gave him a thicker slice of bread that day, spread with a bit of root jam she had saved in a jar. He ate it slowly, watching her bake, and when the bread was shaped and set to rise, she handed him the broom to sweep the hearth. The next day, he gathered dry moss from the edge of the forest. The day after that, he carried water from the stream. He never overstayed, never asked questions, but his presence became a part of the rhythm of her days. He was the first to witness the full ritual of her baking. The way she whispered as she stirred the starter, the way she tested the dough by pressing 2 fingers into it, the way she brushed the top of each loaf with water steeped in rosemary before sliding it into the heat. He did not speak of his loss again, but it hung around him like a second cloak, visible in the way his hands moved when they stilled, in the way he stared at the fire when he thought no one was looking. He built her a proper shelf for her jars. He mended the latch on her door. He hung a bundle of dried herbs above the window to keep the damp away. She never asked. He never offered explanation. Their connection was forged not in words, but in the things they did without needing to speak of them. Soon, the villagers noticed that the man who had once stumbled half dead into her home now stood straighter, carried tools, smiled occasionally, that he did not look ill-fed or frightened, that he worked behind her cottage each day and left only when the light faded. And with that quiet witness, something in their suspicion began to shift. It was not forgiveness. It was not welcome, but it was a soft, first hint of reconsideration. If he had found something worth returning to, perhaps it was not all witchery and pride. One morning, the man brought with him an old woman whose cough rattled in her chest. She said nothing, only sat near the fire while Maria baked, her eyes following each motion with silent understanding. At the end, Maria handed her a piece of bread with honey scraped from the last jar. The woman held it for a long time before eating, tears slipping silently down her face. She used to bake like this, the man said, not looking at Maria. Before the war, before everything changed. That night, 3 more people knocked, then 2 the next. And though most said little and left quickly, they came and they returned. Always the same routine, 1 loaf, 1 slice, wrapped with care and handed out with no question asked. And though some still whispered, though the priest never acknowledged the loaves left at the chapel, though a few eyes still turned cold when she passed, something had undeniably shifted. The man had become more than witness. He had become a bridge. Maria still slept alone, still kept the starter wrapped in cloth near her bed, still counted her forage grains with the same reverence. But when she lit the oven now, it was not only for silence and memory. It was for the people who began to gather at dawn, not in crowds, but in ones and twos, quiet, tired, grateful, and for the man who sat beside the hearth and never asked for more than what was freely given. She had not planned to change the village. She had only meant to survive it. But now, in the warmth of the oven and the hush of rising dough, she felt something begin to mend, not in them, but in herself. Something long closed had cracked open in the presence of that first, unexpected knock. And from it, a new rhythm had emerged. Not just bread, not just ritual, but the first slow leavening of trust. The decision to bake only 1 loaf each morning was not born of scarcity, though the cupboards were still far from full, and the foraged flour ran coarse through her sieve. Nor was it resignation, nor fear, nor even caution. It came to Maria one dawn when the fire was slow to catch, and the air in the cottage clung heavy with the scent of damp wood and old grief. She stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, her breath misting in the chill, the clay bowl empty before her. The starter in its jar had bubbled in the night, alive and urgent, but her hands hovered above it uncertainly. Around her, the world had begun to shift in the faintest way, not in grand gestures or sudden kindness, but in the growing weight of footsteps outside her door, in the hesitant knock of neighbors too proud to ask and too tired to keep pretending they didn't need. The hunger remained, but it had changed shape. Less of a wolf now, more of a shadow that drifted from home to home. And she understood, with a quiet clarity that only comes after long silence, that it was no longer bread alone that filled their emptiness. It was the ritual, the constancy, the belief that every morning, without fail, there would be warmth in a slice, and someone standing behind it who had not yet given up. So she baked just one loaf, carefully measured, deliberately made. She chose the best of her remaining ingredients. A scoop of dried peas ground into flour, the last of her wild garlic, a pinch of her preserved rosemary. She fed the starter slowly, speaking to it as her mother once had, telling it not secrets but memories, as if it too needed reminding that life was still worth rising for. She kneaded the dough with slow, firm hands, folding and pressing, stretching the mixture into form, listening for the rhythm in her muscles, the ache that let her know she was still present in her own body. She shaped the loaf into a tight round and placed it on the stone slab to rise, covered it with a damp cloth, and watched the faint bloom of fermentation begin to swell it into something living. By the time the sun began to rise, she had set out a wooden board just outside her door and placed a baked loaf atop it, wrapped in cloth that still held the scent of the oven. She did not call out. She did not name it. She simply placed a note in front written in careful, unadorned script, *1 slice each. Take only what you need. Trust it to stretch, *. They came in silence, one by one. A man with soot-blackened hands and a limp from years in the mines. A girl no older than 12, cradling a younger sibling against her hip, their eyes wide with the cautious hope of those who have known only denial. An old woman whose cane tapped softly on the stones, who pressed her hand to her heart after receiving her portion, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the moment. Maria stood just inside the doorway, watching without interfering, her hands folded in front of her, her presence a quiet anchor. No one lingered. No one asked for more. And when the last crumb was gone and the board was bare, she returned inside and sat by the fire, her body warmed not by food but by the echo of footsteps fading down the road. Word spread, as such things do, not in proclamation, not in songs or cries of miracle, but in the hush of gratitude passed from hand to hand, in the shared glance between neighbors who had forgotten how to speak to one another without bitterness. Each morning, the line grew by one or two, never too many, never overwhelming. They seemed to understand instinctively that what was being offered was not sustenance alone, but something more fragile, something that could be broken by greed or noise or excess. And so they arrived at dawn with quiet reverence, each taking their slice in turn, offering in return a nod, a murmured thanks, or sometimes nothing at all but the grace of taking only what was given. Maria noticed changes in them. The woman who once turned away now brought her own tin of salt to sprinkle beside the board, so the bread would not taste as plain. A boy began bringing wild herbs wrapped in string, which she dried and folded into the next day's dough. Someone else began leaving small jars, jam, pickled beetroot, rosehip syrup. And though no name was ever attached, she knew it came from someone who had once spit in the dirt when she passed. And once, someone left a small, folded paper, inside of which was written in a child's uneven scrawl, "It tastes like how my mother used to smell." Maria kept that note tucked inside the cupboard door, beside the old tin of buttons and bones and the last drawing her daughter had made before the illness came. She did not ask for more hands, but help began to arrive anyway. The man who had first knocked returned each day with chopped wood and kindling, his silence no longer born of grief alone, but a strange calm that grew between people who no longer needed to explain themselves. He repaired her roof when a storm split the eaves. He built a second shelf for her jars. Sometimes, he sat beside her as the dough rose, not speaking, only existing nearby in a way that felt like companionship rather than intrusion. Others followed his lead. A woman brought her eldest son, a shy boy with clever fingers, who began to carve small wooden spoons and bowls for the cottage. Another neighbor donated an old flour sack, torn at the seam, which Maria patched and now used to line her rising bowl. Without meaning to, without daring to name it, the village had begun to gather itself again, not around doctrine or fear or barter, but around the quiet scent of a daily loaf that arrived without fail and disappeared with just enough dignity to remind them that they were still capable of choosing decency over desperation. Still, she made only one loaf. She resisted suggestions to bake more. Some pleaded. Others tried to offer coin, trade, favors. But she held firm, not out of pride, but from knowing too well the nature of things when they grow too quickly. "One slice," she repeated to them. "Trust it to stretch." And it did, more than once. A child in line would offer to split their piece in two, giving half to someone farther back. A mother would feed her portion to her infant and eat nothing herself. No one went away full, but no one left hollow either. The slice became not just a symbol, but a rhythm, a single act, repeated daily, that stitched one breath to the next. Even the skeptical baker, who still refused to speak to her, had softened, quietly sending his apprentice to learn how to mix root flour without bitterness. The chapel, though its priests remained distant, began placing a basin of clean water beside her board each morning for washing hands before eating. These were gestures, small and wordless, but they were changes nonetheless. Inside the cottage, Maria moved with new steadiness. Her hands, once cracked from the cold and overwork, had softened with the oils gifted from a traveling herbalist. Her back still ached each morning, but she no longer ignored the ache. She stretched before rising, drank warm broth when the pain grew sharp. The rhythm of baking had become a kind of prayer, not for salvation or reward, but for presence. Each motion reminded her of the life she had once known, of the mother who had taught her that miracles were less about heaven and more about flour and fire and waiting. Each morning she woke. She gave thanks, not aloud, not in kneeling, but in the way her hand shaped the dough, as if to say, asterisk, I am still here. I am still willing, asterisk. As spring stirred faintly beneath the frost, the trees budded early, and the creek near the edge of Darnwick began to murmur again with melting snow. Maria knelt near its banks one morning, gathering fresh water, and watched the first green tips of wild garlic emerge from the thawing soil. She smiled without meaning to, her fingers brushing the new leaves, the sunlight warming the back of her neck. In her pocket, she carried the last slice of that morning's loaf, wrapped in cloth, save for the boy who had started bringing her sprigs of mint tied with straw. She would hand it to him with both hands, as she always did, and he would take it like something sacred, and neither would speak, because they did not need to. She returned home with the scent of new earth on her sleeves, and the line at her door was already forming, quiet and patient, as if waiting not just for bread, but for proof that something dependable still existed in a world that too often frayed at the seams. And in that line, in that waiting, in the careful breaking of a single loaf, Maria saw the beginnings of something she had long given up hoping for. Not redemption, not love, but community, slowly leavened, quietly shared, rising like bread from almost nothing at all. The morning they carved bread was into her door. The frost was thin and sharp, etched in delicate lace across the window panes, and the sun broke through it as if reluctant to show its face. Maria had not yet lit the fire when she saw it. Letters gouged deep and uneven into the wood, ragged from a dull blade or a child's impatience, still dark with fresh splinters. The word bled across the grain like a wound, crude and loud against the stillness of the cottage. She stood before it without blinking, one hand resting on the handle of her flour scoop, the other trembling just slightly, not from cold, but from the sudden weight of being pulled back into the shape of the outcast, the mocked, the too strange to trust. It was not the first insult laid against her, but it was the first that felt like it had been etched to remain. She did not cry. She did not scrub the wood clean. Instead, she placed her hand over the slur, her palm open against the chill of the carving, and held it there a moment, as if trying to feel the heat of the hand that had made it. Her breath fogged the air. Her eyes did not close. Then she stepped back inside, lit the fire with care, and began her baking as she always had: water, flour, salt, thyme. The dough rose slowly in the heart's warmth, and she shaped it with calm, steady hands. She brushed the top with rosemary water, as was her habit, scored it with a single line, and watched it swell in the oven's red mouth like something remembering how to live. Outside, the village stirred. Word of the carving traveled quickly, passed through glances and half-spoken sentences at the well, at the market, in the low-roofed chapel, where the priest's silence had lately turned brittle. Some laughed softly behind cupped hands, unsure if it was funny or simply expected. Others frowned and said nothing. A few murmured that perhaps she had brought it on herself. This woman who gave away bread for nothing, who asked for no coin, no favor, not even a word in return. Who did such things? Who fed strangers without asking what they believed, where they came from, what they could offer in trade? Who baked as if it were prayer, but never bowed her head? But when the board outside her cottage was laid out that morning with its single loaf, the line still formed. Slower, perhaps, a little thinner than before. Eyes flicked toward the door, toward the carved slur, then away again. No one mentioned it. No one met her gaze. But they came. A child took her slice with trembling fingers. A man muttered thanks beneath his breath. The girl with the younger brother in tow clutched the cloth-wrapped portion like it was gold. And then the boy came, the same one who had once called her a fraud, who had thrown a stone when her oven had gone cold. He was taller now, less sharp around the edges, but his mouth was still set in that stubborn line she remembered. He stood before the board, staring at the bread, then at the door, then back at the bread. "I didn't carve it," he said, voice rough with shame or pride. Perhaps both, but I know who did. Maria did not ask. She handed him a slice and nodded, her hand brushing his. "I told them you weren't what they said," he added, voice low now, "that you're not a witch, just better than most." She did not smile, but something in her face shifted, an easing like a muscle unclenching. She placed a second piece in his hand. He blinked, confused. "One to give," she said. He nodded and ran. That evening, someone threw a jar of spoiled milk at her stall. The glass shattered against a stone, the stink of rot spreading fast in the winter air. She was not there when it happened, but the girl who tended the baskets of nettle leaves nearby saw it and told the others. Told them there had been a man from the edge of the village, the one who used to sell salt but now sold nothing but rumor. A few muttered that it was no worse than what she deserved, that anyone who stirred pots with no recipe must be stirring other things too. But others stood in silence, and one woman stooped to clean the mess, her hands red from the cold. The next morning, That same woman brought her a jar of jam and placed it beside the board without a word. The day after, a different kind of shift came. The boy, now emboldened by his own small gesture of truth, stood beside her board at dawn and refused to leave. He watched each person who came, nodding solemnly, offering slices when Maria's hands were full. When asked what he was doing, he answered, "I'm here to make sure no one takes more than they need, and to say thank you." Some laughed, some rolled their eyes, but none removed him, and the line moved on. That night, the priest invited her to the chapel. It was the first time in all her days in Darnwick that the offer had come. The invitation was not laced with venom, nor cloaked in forced civility. It was written plainly on folded paper and left at her door, with no title, no pressure, just a time and a request. Please bring bread. She did not go, but she did bake. She rose earlier than usual, ground the flour finer, sifted it twice. She added cracked walnut and the last of the dried berries she had hidden for her own winter stores. She brushed the crust with honey water and folded the dough like it was something sacred. When the loaf cooled, she wrapped it in her mother's linen and walked it to the chapel just before dusk, placing it on the altar without entering. She did not knock. She did not wait. She returned to her cottage and sat by the fire, watching the flames climb higher, licking at the stone with a kind of hunger she recognized in herself. That night, the chapel bells rang. They hadn't rung in months. The village heard them and turned, startled. Some crossed themselves. Some stood still in the snow. And though no sermon followed, no prayer was offered aloud, the sound carried like something old and remembered. And in the morning, when Maria stepped outside, there was no line, only a group gathered quietly around her board, not just for bread, but for her. They didn't speak all at once. They didn't bow their heads or ask forgiveness for the carving or the milk or the silence. But one by one, they stepped forward. Parla came first, the widow who had once warned her not to give too much, who now stood with a tin of honey and a cracked cup of tea. Then the woman who had cleaned the milk. Then the boy, with both his hands empty and his eyes bright. They placed their offerings on the board: a needle, a roll of cloth, a small tin of salt. No coins, just use. And when Maria looked up, she saw that the words on her door had been scrubbed away, though it still bore the scars, the grooves still deep and visible, but someone had cleaned them, polished them, oiled them to shine. The word was gone. The wound remained. She ran her hand over it once, gently, not to forget, but to remember how close it had come to breaking her. Later that day, a girl came who had never taken bread before. She stood awkwardly at the back of the crowd, her hair in uneven braids, her shoes wrapped in cloth. When Maria reached for the last slice, the girl shook her head. "I'm not hungry," she whispered. "I just wanted to help." She held up a bundle wrapped in muslin, raw dough shaped clumsily, uneven and pale. "Can you show me how to bake it right?" she asked. Maria took the bundle with both hands. She did not answer with words. Instead, she opened her door and stepped aside, letting the warmth of the hearth breathe out into the cold. The girl entered, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. Behind her, others lingered: a mother with a child, a man with a bundle of kindling, a boy with a broom. They stood on the threshold, waiting, uncertain, and Maria nodded. That evening, the oven stayed hot long after the sun dipped behind the hills. Not with spectacle, not with noise, but with hands working beside her, awkward and eager, with laughter too quiet to be called celebration, with dough passed between strangers, with silence shared like wine. The loaf she baked was not hers alone, and for the first time in many winters, Darnwick smelled not only of bread, but becoming. The letter arrived on the first warm morning of spring, tucked beneath the cloth that covered the breadboard, folded into a shape so careful and neat that for a moment Maria mistook it for a gift, a child's offering perhaps, a drawing or a pressed flower or one of the small tokens that now appeared at her doorstep like breath, regular and wordless. But when she opened it and saw the name scrawled at the bottom, she dropped the paper. It floated weightless to the ground and lay there like a fallen leaf, humming with the echo of a voice she had not heard in years. The name was her brother's. The boy with the bent smile and the dusty knees. The one who used to chase fireflies in the orchard while their mother hummed lullabies over rising dough. The one who wept when their father died but pretended he hadn't. The boy who had held her hand during the first raids, who had whispered nonsense stories into her ear to drown out the sounds of hunger. The boy she had last seen vanishing into the blur of a smoke-choked hillside, the flash of his coat trailing behind him as soldiers split their town apart. She had mourned him with the kind of grief that turned inward, that built walls rather than altars. She had buried him without a grave, folded his name into silence so deeply that she had not dared to speak it aloud in over a decade. And yet the letter was real, his handwriting unmistakable, slanted and too large, full of earnestness and urgency. The paper bore the faint scent of wood smoke and hay. In it, he said little, only that he had heard of her by accident, through a trader who passed through a nearby village, and spoke of a woman in the north who fed people from an oven older than God. He hadn't known if it was her, not until he heard the description of her bread. The coarse loaves, dense and dark, filled with roots and seeds and warmth, and something else no one could name. And then he knew. He said he had a small farm in the eastern valleys now, far from the noise, where the soil was beginning to turn soft again, where the frost receded early and the sky didn't hang as heavy. He had a place for her, if she wanted, a room, a fire, a patch of land to grow things that didn't have to feed on grief. Maria read the letter 3 times that morning. Then she sat beside the hearth and left it untouched for a day. Then 2, then 7. She did not reply. Instead, she baked. Her hands were more precise now than they had ever been. Every movement honed by repetition. Every fold and turn of the dough guided by instinct so familiar it felt like breath. The dough no longer resisted her touch. It leaned into it. She still made only 1 loaf each morning, but it had become a ceremony now, something shared between her and the village, not as transaction, but covenant. Children waited for the steam to rise from the cloth. Women brought scraps of herbs and dried fruit. Men offered wood and repairs and the kind of quiet company that asked for nothing in return. Her days moved in a rhythm that had become less about survival and more about sustaining. A community not born from blood or name, but from a slow accretion of trust. But the letter sat there, a reminder, a possibility. She tried to imagine what it would be like to leave, to rise one morning and not need the dough, to walk past the oven without feeding the fire, to let her apron hang untouched and to close the cottage door behind her. She tried to picture the road stretching eastward, the hills rolling out like old parchment, the weight of satchel slung over her shoulder, the taste of wind not shaped by Darnwick's valleys, but by someplace unfamiliar, where the air smelled not of stone and ash and moss, but of something new. She did not speak of the letter, not to the man who now came each day to mend fences and sweep the ashes, not to the girl who baked beside her in the evenings, her hands flower pale and full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask, not to Parla, who had begun delivering dried nettle leaves tied with ribbon, nor to the boy who had once thrown stones and now kept the cottage woodpile stacked neatly without being told. It was hers alone, this new uncertainty, this sudden fracture in the steady rhythm she had worked so hard to build. Then one evening, she found them waiting outside her door. 3 girls, no older than 12, barefoot and shy, each holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she opened the door, they looked up at her with eyes that held the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or dying mothers. "We want to learn," the tallest said. "Not just help. Learn. Like all of it." The other 2 nodded. Maria didn't answer. She stepped back from the threshold and opened the door wide. That night, they sat around the wooden table while she showed them how to feed the starter, how to stir gently, how to fold the cloth without disturbing their eyes. She taught them how to listen to the dough, how to know when it was ready by the way it sighed under the palm. She let them mix the flour with their hands, even when it scattered across the table like snow, even when one of them spilled the water and nearly dropped the bowl. She did not correct with sharpness, only silence and demonstration, the way her mother had taught her. They returned the next night, and the one after, each time a little more certain, a little more careful. Word spread, quietly as it always had. By the end of the month, 7 children came, then 10. A boy with thick arms who shaped the dough too tightly. A girl with a limp who cried when the crust burned. Two siblings who argued about everything until the loaves were in the oven, then held hands until they cooled. Maria began to rise earlier. She prepared extra flour. She divided the starter, carefully, naming each new jar with the child who would tend it. She still made the morning loaf herself. That would not change. But now, in the evenings, the cottage glowed brighter, with voices, with movement, with possibility. Still, the letter remained. Some nights, she would hold it in her lap as the dough rose, trace the edges, reread the words. Lure's voice lived in them, not the boy he had been, but the man he had become. His lines were steadier now, less wild, but full of longing. She could feel it between every phrase, that yearning to gather again, to belong to someone who remembered him as more than a survivor. He spoke of the soil as if it were a person, of the land as something that had forgiven him. He spoke of solitude, not with sorrow, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had made peace with it. She could see it, if she closed her eyes. A life not shaped by scarcity, days spent planting, kneading bread without measuring hunger, sleeping in warmth not borrowed but her own. But then she would look around the cottage, at the girl turning the dough with both palms as if praying, at the boy who now swept without being asked, at the spoon carved by the baker's apprentice, at the cloth embroidered with the clumsy stitches of a dozen small hands, and she would remember that the bread here was not hers alone, that the life she had made, even in silence, even in exile, had rooted itself in the people who returned, who learned, who carried it forward even when she did not ask them to. One morning, just before dawn, she took the letter to the edge of the woods. She did not burn it. She placed it inside a hollow tree, tucked safely among the roots, pressed flat like a secret not yet ready to be spoken. She whispered her brother's name once into bark, not as farewell, but as promise. Then she returned home and lit the fire. That day, when the children arrived, she handed the bowl to the girl with the braid too tight and said, "First, we breathe warmth into the bowl." And the girl nodded, her hands already reaching for the flour. Maria stood back and watched, not as teacher, not as keeper, but as witness. The bread was no longer hers to carry alone. And maybe one day, when the hills turned gold and the wind softened, she would write back. But for now, she had all she needed, not to leave, but to stay, and in staying, to rise again. By the time the summer sun began to linger longer in the sky and the shadows stretched like softened wool across the stones of Darnwick, Maria's cottage had become something more than a place to sleep or bake or pass quietly through. It had grown into a rhythm at the edge of the village, a pulse that could be felt before it was seen, a center not marked on any map, but known by anyone who had once stood in line for a slice of warmth. The path to her door, once overgrown and avoided, had worn itself into something permanent, pressed smooth by bare feet, by small boots, by knees of children chasing one another, flour on their cheeks and fire in their laughter. The oven, once her only companion, now glowed not for silence but for gathering. The heat of it reached into dusk, braided with voices, with clatter and song, with instruction whispered between hands over dough too wet or too dry or stubborn in the way that all things worth loving eventually are. What began as lessons for three had grown, slowly, without announcement or plan, into something alive. Maria did not call it school. She did not give it a name. But others did. They called it the sourdough school, the bread house, the warm place, depending on who was speaking and how much reverence they carried in their voice. Some said it with humor, a fondness they were still learning how to wear openly. Others said it the way they might say grace. What mattered to Maria was not what they named it, but what they brought with them when they came. The children returned day after day. Some in the evenings after work in the fields, others at dawn before the sun had cleared the ridge. They arrived with hands chapped and calloused, with sleeves rolled high, with questions tucked into their mouths and fears hidden in their pockets. They brought dough they had tried and failed to shape, loaves that had risen too high and collapsed, others that had never risen at all. They brought herbs from their gardens, wild yeast scraped from fruit skins, stories from kitchens that no longer stood. They carried loss and longing, though they did not always know it. Maria welcomed each with the same steady quiet, guiding their hands, showing without words how to feel the readiness in a dough's breath, how to listen to the crackle of crust as it cooled, how to wait for the moment before flame and flour became something more. She never raised her voice. She rarely gave praise in the way others did, but she noticed, she remembered. She handed back loaves with a nod, a quiet of approval, a slice wrapped in linen for the walk home. And they noticed in return. They brought small things in thanks, a braid of dried flowers, a whistle carved from bone, a rag doll with a flour sack face. One girl embroidered a cloth with tiny red stitches, clumsy but earnest. That red asterisk, one slice, shared well. Asterisk Maria kept it folded near the window, beside the jar of her mother's starter, where it caught the morning light and glowed. Some of the older children began to teach the younger ones. Maria watched this with kind of quiet awe, the same way she once watched dough rise after a long cold spell, not trusting it fully but marveling that it dared to try. A boy who had once wept when his crust burned now showed another how to score the top with a blade. A girl who had never spoken above a whisper now gave instructions on kneading, her hands never pausing, her voice soft but firm. They corrected one another gently, with flour-smeared fingers and laughter that rose like yeast in the warm air. She did not tell them they were becoming something. She didn't need to. They already knew. The villagers, once wary or dismissive, now came in growing numbers, not just of bread, but to be near the place that had transformed itself without asking permission. The market women lingered after delivering baskets of grain, staying long enough to see what the children were shaping. The older men brought stories from their youth, recipes half remembered, tales of harvest feasts long past. Parla, now slower on her feet, came each week with a jar of something sour or sweet and sat near the oven, not to work but to watch. She said little, but her eyes followed every movement, as if she were tracing memory itself. Even the baker, the one who had once scorned Maria's presence, had begun to change. He still kept to his corner of the market, still sold his loaves at fair price, still prided himself on uniformity and lightness. But now he nodded when he saw her. Once, he sent his apprentice with a bundle of wheat he could not use, too coarse, too rustic for his patrons. But it might suit your style, the boy said, and Maria took it without comment. She sifted it 3 times, blended it with ground wild carrot, and let the children bake it into rounds so dense they sank into the cooling board. She laughed then, for the first time in weeks, when they all agreed it was the best bread yet. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, the man who had first knocked came to sit beside her, not to chop wood or fix hinges, but just to sit. They rarely spoke, but in their silence was a thread of comfort that needed no words. Once, he handed her a piece of wood he had carved into the shape of a seed. It fit in her palm like it had always belonged there. She placed on the shelf beside the buttons and notes and other offerings that had become part of the space, the small reliquary of the life she had chosen. There were still days of sorrow, days when the loaves failed, when the fire died too soon, when illness returned to a neighbor's house, or the cold crept back without warning. On those days, the children worked more quietly. The laughter softened. Maria's hands ached in the joints. Her breath caught in her chest. But even then, the oven was never cold. Someone always came to tend it. A child with thin arms and bright eyes would feed the fire and shape the dough while she rested. And when the bread came out of the oven, steaming and imperfect, it was shared all the same. And so the rhythm continued. Not faster, not louder, but deeper. The school grew roots, not branches. It did not expand in walls or in name, but in memory, in touch, in the small, stubborn kindness that passed between hands needing the same mixture of dust and water and time. Maria, who had once known herself only through the labor of solitude, now began to feel herself held in a different way. Not exalted, not needed, but seen. She watched her own legacy unfold not as story, but as repetition. Every child who returned brought back not just knowledge, but care. Every loaf shaped under another's hands bore the mark of hers, whether they knew it or not. It was not a miracle. It was not salvation, but it was bread, shared well, and it was enough. As summer edged into fullness, the oven was rebuilt, stone by stone, with help from every corner of the village. A man laid the foundation. A woman mixed the mortar. A child placed the final brick, laughing when the smoke curled high and clean into the sky. They painted no plaque. They named no founder. But everyone knew this was the center now. Maria stood beside the oven that night, her hands resting on the stone, warm beneath her palms. She looked out at the crowd, neighbors, students, strangers who were no longer strangers. They were eating slices by lantern light, bread torn and passed from hand to hand, jam spread thick, mouths full, hearts fuller. No one needed to say it aloud. She had given them bread. They had given her back the world. Years passed with the same quiet rhythm that had once begun with a single loaf. The cottage, though never grand, aged into its place like something meant to be there all along. Its stones settled deeper into the earth, its roof thick with moss and memory, the path to its door smoothed by hundreds of feet, small and large, that had come and gone with the seasons. The oven, rebuilt and worn in once again by fire and flour, continued to burn every morning, though Maria no longer rose quite as early as she once had. Her hands, still precise, had grown slower, the strength of her wrists softened by time, the bones bending gently toward stillness. She no longer needed alone. The children she had taught now stood beside her, taller, steadier, their movements echoes of hers but altered by their own rhythms. They did not need instruction anymore. They needed only presence. And that she gave. The school had never been written into existence, but it had outlasted storms and sickness and scarcity, growing into a kind of inheritance that could not be recorded in ledgers or laws. The youngest children still came with their mismatched shoes and hopeful eyes, carrying bowls from home and bundles of cloth wrapped around handfuls of seeds or dried herbs. They learned to mix and fold and wait. They burned their first crusts and forgot to feed their starter and wept when their loaves fell flat. And each time, someone older stood beside them, not to scold, but to show, to guide, to remind. The cycle of it was steady and generous, a tide of giving and receiving that did not name itself charity, but simply the way things ought to be. Maria watched it all unfold with a stillness that carried gratitude more than ownership. She no longer needed to explain who she was or why she had come. No one asked her where she had learned to bake or what she had lost. They knew, in the way you know the shape of a story not by its words, but by how it feels to carry it. Her past had softened into legend, not a tale of miracles, but a steadiness of a woman who came with almost nothing and gave what she could until something larger than herself began to grow. Some of the children called her Mother Crumb, not mockingly, but with affection that made her laugh the first time she heard it. She had never tried to be anything other than useful, and now that was how they spoke of her. Useful, steady, warm. There were days she stayed in bed longer, when her joints ached and the cold returned too quickly to her hands. On those days, the children lit the fire without her. They prepared the dough in silence, out of respect rather than hesitation, and left the loaf on the board outside for the village, just as she had done for so many years. And when she came to the hearth in the afternoon, wrapped in shawls and carrying her spoon, they made space for her without fuss, pressing warm tea into her palms, telling her what they had done, how it had risen, how the crust had cracked just right. They asked nothing of her but her nearness, and that, too, she gave. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother's kitchen, not as it had been during the worst of times, but in its earliest warmth, when the light came through the window like gold and the scent of rising dough filled the corners of the room. She would wake with tears on her cheeks and the memory of laughter just out of reach. But the sorrow no longer pulled her downward. It had become a part of her, a gentle ache, like the tender spot where an old burn never fully fades, but no longer hurts. Her mother was with her still, in the starter jar that had never died, in the way her hands moved without thought, in the hush of the children as they listened for the right moment to shape the loaves. One afternoon, as summer folded toward harvest, a girl she had taught nearly a decade ago returned. She had left as a child and come back as a woman, taller than Maria remembered, with wind-burned cheeks and calloused fingers, her voice deeper, her eyes brighter. She carried a cloth-wrapped parcel, and when she unfolded it, she revealed a slice of bread, one of Maria's oldest recipes, but changed. It was lighter, airier, flecked with thyme and lemon peel. When Maria took a bite, The flavor bloomed on her tongue, unexpected and familiar all at once. She chewed slowly, savoring it, and then smiled, not the proud smile of a teacher whose student has succeeded, but the softened, grateful smile of someone who had been given back a part of herself she didn't know she had lost. "You've made it yours," she said, voice low. The girl nodded. "You showed us how." And then, unexpectedly, Maria wept, not from sorrow, not from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that what she had carried all these years would not end with her, that the knowledge, the care, the rhythm, none of it would be buried when her hands finally stilled. It would live on in these children, these neighbors, these slices of bread taken into kitchens she had never seen. That even if the world turned cruel again, there would always be someone who remembered how to mix flour and water and salt into something more than survival. The day she could no longer bake came gently, with no great announcement. She rose, lit the fire, prepared the bowl, but her hands did not respond. They trembled too fiercely to hold the spoon, her wrists aching with a deep, unreachable throb. She sat down at the table, her breath thin in her chest, and closed her eyes. The room filled with the quiet murmur of the children arriving, the door opening and closing with the familiarity of routine. Someone took the bowl from her. Another laid a warm shawl across her shoulders. A voice, soft but certain, began to instruct. She opened her eyes and saw the oven glowing, the dough rising, the hands of others shaping what she had once shaped alone. She smiled. She watched. She rested. That winter, the cottage remained warm. The oven never went dark. On the coldest mornings, the board outside still held a slice wrapped in cloth, steam rising into the gray light like breath. The children had grown. The village no longer feared hunger as it once had. They had learned to trust in their own ability to share, to sustain, to feed not just the body, but the soul that survives between silence and labor. When Maria died, there was no funeral in the traditional sense, no procession, no sermon. Instead, they gathered at the cottage. They cleaned it together, every corner, every shelf. They lit the fire with wood from every household, and each person brought a loaf, not perfect, not uniform, but all shaped with the care she had taught them. They sliced them thin and placed them on the board. One by one, they took a piece and broke it in their hands. They did not speak of her in grand terms. They said only this: she gave and we learned. She taught us how to rise. And still the oven burns. The school continues, changing with the children who teach now as they were once taught. They say her name only sometimes, but her touch remains, in the way dough is kneaded with reverence, in the way no one takes more than one slice, in the way strangers are always fed before they are questioned. Maria left no monument, only warmth, only memory, only the taste of bread, shared well, that could stretch across a village and hold it together like a seam sewn through time. And in that, she was never truly gone.